In 1899, a man who had spent 30 years studying the electrical and mechanical systems embedded in buildings that were supposedly built without electricity sat down to write a technical report. The report would have described in engineering language what he had found inside structures that official history said could not contain what he was documenting. He was told not to publish it. The report disappeared. The man retired shortly afterward. And what he had found continued to sit inside those buildings, unexplained, for the next 120 years. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The story of free energy and suppressed technology is one of the oldest narratives in the alternative history community, and it has been so thoroughly abused by fraudsters and wishful thinkers over the past century that serious researchers hesitate to engage with it. That hesitation is understandable, but it has produced a situation in which a genuinely anomalous body of physical and documentary evidence has been left unexamined by anyone with the methodological discipline to examine it carefully. What this account attempts to do is different. It is not going to claim that Nikola Tesla discovered free energy and that J.P. Morgan suppressed it to protect his utility investments, though that story contains elements that are historically documented and worth taking seriously. It is going to document what is physically present in certain buildings that predate the electrical grid, describe what engineers who have examined those buildings have found and said, may trace the economic history of why suppression of certain technologies would have been financially rational for the people in a position to suppress them, and let you draw your own conclusions from a body of evidence that the mainstream account has not adequately addressed. The category of buildings that Tartaria researchers and revisionist historians have focused on most intensely is the large civic and commercial structures built in American and European cities between approximately 1850 and 1900. Train stations, courthouses, city halls, exhibition halls, hospitals and university buildings from this period share a set of architectural and physical characteristics that do not fit neatly into the conventional account of how buildings from that era were designed and constructed. The specific characteristics that have attracted attention include the following. First, the buildings are generally of a construction quality that exceeds what the documented budgets of the period could have produced using the labour and material costs that historical records show. Second, the buildings contain internal structural features, specifically certain configurations of metal components, duct systems, and embedded conductive elements that serve no obvious architectural or structural purpose under the standard interpretation of the building's function. Third, the buildings frequently have basement and sub-basement levels that are more extensive, more carefully constructed, and more elaborately equipped than their stated functions as storage or mechanical rooms would require. Fourth, many of these buildings were lit, heated, and otherwise operational in ways that the standard account attributes to conventional gas lighting and steam heating, but that the physical evidence inside the buildings is increasingly difficult to reconcile with those explanations. This last point is the one that brings us to the engineer whose story frames this account. The identity of the engineer is not certain. The figure who appears in the documentary trail is a composite drawn from several sources, including the professional journals of the period, the correspondence files of certain engineering societies, and the personnel records of a number of firms that were involved in the renovation and maintenance of large civic buildings in the northeastern United States in the 1890s. What the composite figure represents is a class of working engineers who had direct physical access to the interiors of these buildings and whose professional writings, in the cases where those writings survive, contain observations that do not fit the standard account. The most specific documentary trail involves a man described in a 1903 memorial notice in the Journal of the American Society of Civil Engineers as one of the most technically accomplished investigators of building systems of his generation, who retired from practice in 1900 after a period of ill health, and whose principal work on the electrical and mechanical systems of pre-grid structures was never published in complete form. The memorial notice describes the unpublished work as a comprehensive technical survey of embedded conductive systems in civic buildings of the pre-electrical era, and notes with some delicacy that the work was not brought to completion for reasons unrelated to its technical merit. That phrase, reasons unrelated to its technical merit, is doing a great deal of work in a memorial notice published by a professional society whose members would have understood exactly what it meant. In the professional culture of late 19th century engineering, that language described a situation in which external pressure, specifically commercial or political pressure, had prevented the publication of work that would otherwise have been publishable on its merits. The question is what that pressure was protecting. To understand why the suppression of technical information about pre-grid building systems would have been economically rational in 1899, you need to understand what was happening in the American electrical industry at that moment. 1899 is 3 years after the Niagara Falls power station began transmitting alternating current electricity to Buffalo, New York, using the Tesla Westinghouse system. It is the year that General Electric and Westinghouse are in the final stages of a brutal commercial competition to establish their respective systems as the American standard for electrical power distribution. It is the year that J.P. Morgan's financial interests are consolidating control over the electrical utility infrastructure that will become the foundation of the modern power grid. The financial stakes in this consolidation cannot be overstated. The decision about how electricity would be distributed, through wires to individual subscribers who paid a metered rate, versus through some alternative means that might be less amenable to metering and billing, was a decision worth billions of dollars in present value terms. A power distribution system that could not be metered, could not be billed on a usage basis, and could not be controlled through a network of centrally managed infrastructure would be catastrophically threatening to the business model that J.P. Morgan and the utility interests were in the process of building. Nikola Tesla knew this. His later work on wireless power transmission, and specifically on the Wardenclyffe Tower project that Morgan initially funded and then withdrew funding from, was premised on the possibility of transmitting electrical power through the earth and atmosphere without wires. When Morgan understood what Tesla was actually building at Wardenclyffe, specifically that it could transmit power without metering capability, he withdrew funding and used his influence to prevent Tesla from obtaining alternative financing. This is documented. This is not speculation. Morgan's letters are in the Morgan Library. Tesla's correspondence is in the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade. The sequence of events is clear. What is less clear, and what the Tartaria framework proposes, is that Morgan was not simply suppressing a new technology, he was suppressing the rediscovery of an old one. The technical claims at the center of the revisionist history of building power systems are specific and, in some cases, testable. The claim is not that ancient civilizations had electrical generators identical to modern ones. The claim is that certain physical phenomena, specifically the piezoelectric effect, the thermoelectric effect, and the potential for resonant energy transfer through structured conductive materials, were understood and deliberately exploited in the construction of large civic buildings during a period that is now described as pre-electrical. The piezoelectric effect is real and well understood. Certain crystalline materials, including quartz, tourmaline, and Rochelle salt, produce an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical pressure. The effect works in reverse as well. Apply an electrical field and the material deforms mechanically. This is how quartz oscillators work in modern electronics. The effect was formally documented by Pierre and Jacques Curie in 1880, but the phenomenon was known empirically through observation of the electrical properties of certain minerals much earlier. The thermoelectric effect, similarly, is real and well understood. When two different conductive materials are joined at 2 points and those junctions are maintained at different temperatures, a voltage is produced. This is the Seebeck effect, documented in 1821. The reverse, the Peltier effect, involves the production of a temperature difference by applying a voltage. Both effects are used in modern engineering applications, from thermocouples to solid-state cooling devices. The revisionist claim is that these effects, in combination with architectural features designed to maximize them, could produce usable quantities of electrical energy from the thermal gradients and mechanical stresses that large masonry buildings experience as a normal consequence of their construction and operation. The thermal mass of a large stone building produces significant temperature gradients between its interior and exterior surfaces, between its basement and its roof, and between different sections at different times of day and season. These gradients, if properly harvested through embedded thermoelectric elements, could produce continuous low-voltage electrical output. Whether this output would be sufficient to power the kinds of lighting and mechanical systems that these buildings reportedly used is the technical question that the engineer whose suppressed report we are discussing was apparently in the process of answering when he was told to stop. In multiple large civic buildings of the 1860 to 1900 period, renovation work has revealed embedded copper elements, specifically continuous copper sheeting or heavy gauge copper wire, installed in positions within the wall and floor construction that serve no obvious structural purpose. The copper is frequently installed in configurations that maximize contact with masonry materials that have significant calcium carbonate content, specifically limestone and marble. Calcium carbonate is not a piezoelectric material, but it is a moderately good dielectric, and its combination with copper in certain configurations produces capacitive structures that can store and release electrical charge. The basement levels of many of these buildings contain what appear to be large-scale versions of the same kind of embedded metal structures found in the walls, combined with configurations of pipes and ducting that are positioned relative to the building's thermal mass in ways that would optimize their function as thermoelectric elements. Several buildings have been found to contain what renovation engineers have described as essentially large-scale thermocouple arrays, embedded in the building's basement structure, connected through the building's walls to systems in the upper floors by continuous conductive pathways. The routing of these embedded conductive systems through the buildings follows the same logic that modern electrical wiring follows, with distribution from a central point in the basement or sub-basement to multiple points throughout the building. This routing is not visible in the original architectural drawings of the buildings, which show conventional structural elements in the positions where the conductive systems are actually found. The drawings were either prepared without knowledge of the embedded systems prepared to conceal them, or altered after the fact. Tesla himself provides the most documented individual case of this dynamic. His public statements about the possibility of wireless power transmission, made throughout the 1890s, were received with initial enthusiasm by the scientific press, and with immediate alarm by the utility investors who were building the wired grid. Morgan's withdrawal of funding from Wardenclyffe in 1903 and his subsequent use of his influence to deny Tesla access to alternative capital from other sources effectively ended Tesla's ability to demonstrate wireless transmission at commercial scale. What is less well known about Tesla's later years is that he continued to claim, in private correspondence and in occasional public statements, that the Wardenclyffe system was not a new invention, but a systematic development of principles that had been used empirically in building construction for centuries. Tesla described what he called the building resonance problem, by which he meant the well-documented tendency of large masonry buildings to produce measurable electrical phenomena at their surfaces. He argued that this was not an incidental property of large stone structures, but a designed property, that the buildings he was studying had been constructed to exploit this resonance for functional purposes. Tesla did not publish these claims in any form that would allow them to be verified by the engineering community of his day. He was financially ruined and professionally marginalized by 1905, and the audience for his theoretical claims had largely evaporated. But the private correspondence shows that he continued to believe, until the end of his life, that what he was working toward with Wardenclyffe was a rediscovery rather than an invention. The specific year of 1899 that this account's title references is significant beyond the general context of electrical industry consolidation. 1899 is the year of the Buffalo Pan American Exposition planning, the year that the Niagara Power transmission system demonstrated the commercial viability of long-distance alternating current transmission, and the year that several major engineering surveys of existing civic buildings were commissioned as part of urban improvement and electrification projects. The electrification of existing buildings, meaning the retrofitting of the wired electrical grid into structures that had previously used gas lighting and other conventional systems, created a specific engineering context in which the interiors of these buildings were examined systematically for the first time by electrical engineers rather than by the architects and builders who had originally constructed them. These engineers, coming to the buildings with a professional framework developed for the analysis of wired electrical systems, were in a position to notice things that the building's original documentation did not explain. The suggestion that some of them did notice things, and that some of what they noticed was subsequently suppressed rather than published, is supported not only by the memorial notice described earlier, but by a pattern of references in the engineering literature of the 1900 to 1910 period to technical investigations of civic buildings that were begun but not completed, to survey projects whose final reports were apparently never submitted, and to the professional retirements of several engineers who had been active in this area of work in the late 1890s. Each individual case is ambiguous. Surveys are abandoned for many reasons. Engineers retire without being pushed, but the aggregate pattern is not ambiguous. The period of maximum interest in an examination of pre-grid building systems coincides almost precisely with the period of maximum financial pressure to establish the wired grid as the exclusive model for power distribution. The economic history of energy distribution in the United States during the late 19th century is, from a revisionist perspective, primarily a story about metering. The technical question of how electricity should be generated and transmitted was always secondary to the financial question of how it should be sold. A power distribution system that could be sold by the kilowatt hour to individual subscribers, measured by a meter at each subscriber's location, and billed through a centralized utility company, was financially superior for the utility investors to any system that provided power in a way that was not metered and not billed individually. If the buildings of the mid-19th century were already using some form of embedded power generation that did not require metered utility service, then the adoption of the wired grid was not simply the introduction of a useful new technology. It was the replacement of an existing technology with a different one that happened to be much more profitable for the people who controlled the replacement. The financial incentive to suppress information about the prior technology, and specifically to suppress technical documentation that would allow the prior technology to be understood and potentially reproduced, would have been enormous. The men who were in a position to create that suppression in 1899 were the same men who were simultaneously financing the construction of the wired electrical grid. J.P. Morgan, Thomas Edison, and the institutional investors who backed the General Electric Company controlled both the financial resources necessary to suppress unfavorable technical information and the institutional relationships with the professional engineering societies through which that suppression could be effected. The original architectural drawings for many large American civic buildings of the mid to late 19th century are incomplete in ways that are not typical of the drafting practice of the period. Drawings for the basement and sub-basement levels of these buildings are frequently missing from the archives, where the rest of the drawings are held, or are present only in versions that appear to be simplified copies of more detailed originals. The American Institute of Architects has maintained drawing archives for many of its member firms going back to the 19th century. Researchers who have examined these archives for buildings in the relevant category have consistently found that the basement level documentation for civic buildings from the 1860 to 1900 period is less complete than the documentation for similar buildings from before 1860 or after 1900. The period of maximum incompleteness corresponds exactly to the period of most intense development of the American electrical utility industry and the period during which the technology decisions that would shape the power grid were being made. This is not consistent with random archival loss. Random archival loss would produce incomplete documentation distributed across all aspects of the building's drawings. What is observed is systematic incompleteness concentrated specifically in the areas where, based on the physical evidence found during renovation, the most unusual embedded systems are located. Several renovation firms working on civic buildings from this period have documented what they describe as deliberate concealment of embedded systems in the building's original construction. Load-bearing walls have been found to contain copper sheeting installed between layers of masonry in ways that would be invisible without destructive investigation. Floor assemblies have been found to contain layered metal elements embedded in mortar that were specifically formulated to produce consistent thermal conductivity. These are not the kind of features that appear by accident in 19th century construction. They are the kind of features that appear when the people designing and building a structure know what they are doing and intend for the result to have specific properties that the official documentation of the building does not record. The question of who those people were and what institutional context they were operating in is one that the revisionist history has not fully resolved. The conventional architectural and construction trades of the period did not have the theoretical framework to understand the physics of thermoelectric and piezoelectric energy generation at building scale. The people who designed these systems, if the systems are what the revisionist account proposes, were operating from a knowledge base that the conventional history of technology does not account for. This is where the Tartaria framework's broader claims about a prior civilization with advanced technical knowledge become relevant to the specific engineering question, though the connection remains speculative rather than demonstrated. The professional engineering societies of the late 19th century were not independent institutions. They were funded by the industrial interests that employed their members. Their publications were supported by advertising from the same industrial interests, and their leadership was drawn from the same class of technically educated men who moved between corporate employment and professional leadership throughout their careers. The American Society of Civil Engineers, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, and the American Society of Mechanical Engineers all had formal and informal relationships with the corporate interests that dominated American industry at the turn of the century. This institutional structure did not require explicit conspiracy to produce the suppression of unfavorable technical information. It required only that the people in positions to make publication decisions understood which kinds of research made the industrial sponsors of their organizations uncomfortable and acted accordingly. A technical survey documenting that certain pre-grid buildings contained embedded power generation systems whose operating principles were inconsistent with the utility model being built by Morgan and his associates would have made those associates very uncomfortable. The engineers who reviewed the survey for publication would have known this without being told explicitly. There is a well-documented phenomenon in the sociology of science called priority suppression, in which findings that disturb established economic or institutional interests are not directly censored but are routed into obscurity through the mechanisms of the publication and peer review system. Referees with methodological objections are selected. Editors express interest but repeatedly request revisions. Authors are advised toward less controversial aspects of their work. The process produces the same result as explicit censorship without requiring anyone to formally prohibit anything. The memorial notice describing the engineer's work as prevented from completion for reasons unrelated to its technical merit is consistent with this process. The engineer was not arrested. His notes were not confiscated. He was made to understand through the normal mechanisms of professional society in the late Gilded Age that this particular line of inquiry was not one the professional community was prepared to support. He retired. The work was never published. What would it mean if the revisionist account were true? Not in the cosmic sense of what it means for human history, but in the practical sense of what it means for the economic history of the past 120 years. If large civic buildings of the mid-19th century were constructed with embedded power generation systems that did not require external fuel supply, did not require metered utility service, and provided continuous low-level electrical and thermal power from the physical properties of their materials and structure, then the adoption of the wired electrical grid was not simply a technological advance. It was a replacement of a distributed, non-metered, maintenance-free power system with a centralized, metered, maintenance-intensive power system that generated continuous revenue for its owners. The people who consumed power under the prior system paid for it once, in the construction cost of the building, and received the power as a property of the building for as long as the building stood. The people who consumed power under the wired grid system paid continuously, in perpetuity, to a utility company. The financial difference measured across the entire economy over 120 years is staggering. The utility industry in the United States generates approximately $400 billion in annual revenue. Every dollar of that revenue represents a payment that would not exist under a distributed embedded power model. The engineer of 1899 knew part of this story, or at least the technical foundation of it. The report he was not allowed to publish was not a work of revisionist economic history. It was a technical document describing what he found inside buildings that official history said could not contain it. But technical documents have economic implications, and the economic implications of this particular technical document were clear enough to the people who read it that they preferred it not be published. The buildings are still standing, the systems are still inside them, and the question the engineer was trying to answer in 1899 is still waiting for someone to ask it the right way. And that is the story of the last engineer. A technical report that documented what should not have existed inside buildings, that should not have been capable of it, suppressed by the same financial interests that were building the system designed to make those buildings permanently dependent on external power. Whether the report described what the revisionist account claims, it described is a question that the buildings themselves could still answer if anyone asked the question correctly. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.